Okay, we now come to one person. We've looked at the fear of man in a marriage and how it affects everything in the marriage, and how the husband can become embittered at the wife, thinks that she's the problem, and he's the one that started it. We've looked biblically at Adam, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and now we're going to look, we've looked at King Saul as being the man that really has so much, and it so of course epitomizes in many ways the fear of man that we all deal with. And then we're going to go now to the fear of man in David's life. And not a big surprise that he would be gummed up with Saul in this. Saul's life ended, as we've done in the teaching on the fear of man, ended with, he literally died of embarrassment. We won't go into that. You can hear that teaching in another place, but he killed himself because he was afraid he was going to be captured by the Philistines and it would look bad on him. And so, but David doesn't end like that. But he had the fear of man in his life, and it's rather subtle. And so I want us to go through the scriptures and see how this happened and where it happened and the evidences that we see of it. These things are in our lives. This is the point. God gives us these testimonies that we would see them, not to go, oh, okay, I'm going to obey that, but instead to go and humble yourself before God and get His power in the situation. And we're going to follow the same steps that we did with the other men and marriages. And that first step, point, I guess, would be better. But the fear of man supplants the fear of God. And I'm going to read from 1 Samuel 18. We'll start in verse 6. And this is the early interaction between David and Saul and King Saul. And David has gone out to fight for Saul. David is under the authority of the king. He's got the army because of the king, and he goes out and fights. But he comes back from a victory, and we see in 1 Samuel 18:6, it happened as they were coming, when David returned from killing the Philistine, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing, to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy and musical instruments. The women sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul became very angry, for this saying displeased him. And he said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, but to me they have ascribed thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. Now, how do we see the fear of man in this? It would have been very easy for David to have stopped the accolades and said, please, I need to tell you something. I'm the king's man. This is not my battle. I'm simply serving the king. He supplied the army. He didn't correct the women. He didn't give praise to the king. He had been very humble and meek before, but you see here some flattery that he evidently accepted. And remember, we've read this before. A man who flatters his neighbor is spreading a net for his steps. The same chapter in Proverbs 29, verse 25, the fear of man brings a snare. Well, Saul, being an expert at the fear of man, decides to do something. And again, the fear of man has already begun to take hold a little bit in David. But then we're going to see how Saul uses underhanded methods and uses his own family and uses flattery to trap, laying the snare for David. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, and we'll start with verse 17. 1 Samuel 18:17. Then Saul said to David, "Here is my older daughter Merab. I will give her to you as a wife. Only be a valiant man for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "My hand shall not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." But David said to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be the king's son-in-law?" So it came about at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, she was given to Adriel the Meholothite there for a wife. If you look at David's refusal, it sounds a whole lot like some of the things that Saul said. It wasn't humility. He had already begun to waver a little bit. And we see in 1 Samuel 18, he first says, "Who am I?" That's a good thing. He next says, "What is my life?" That's a good and humble thing. And then the next thing, "or my father's family in Israel." Now, what's he doing? First, he's comparing. And the Bible says that if you compare yourself to others, you're not wise. Comparison of lineage, and he dishonored his father. It's not good. And then he uses this phrase that says, and I think we'll see the subtlety in it, that I should be the king's son-in-law. The thought is now in his mind and on his tongue. Now, then Saul uses his daughter's love for David, again, as a trap. Going on in 1 Samuel 18 to verse 20. Now, Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. When they told Saul, the thing was agreeable to him. Saul thought, "I will give her to him that she may become a snare to him, that the hand of the Philistines may be against him." Therefore, Saul said to David, "For a second time you may be my son-in-law today." Again, he's flattering. He's using the phrase, "my son-in-law," the king's son-in-law. And of course, this would be an honor, but he's making sure he uses that phrase. Now, one of the things that in this, and I'll go ahead and kind of tell you why that phrase is bothersome. Michal, when this started out, loved David. She really loved him, evidently. The Bible says so. It's obvious Saul didn't love him, but you see, Saul, nobody, in fact, is saying you can become Michal's husband. The whole thing is you can be the king's son-in-law. There's not a lot of worth given to Michal. All the worth is given only to King Saul. And again, you hear the selfishness that the fear of man is involved in. Anyway, he eventually involves some third parties. We see in verse 22, I believe, "Then Saul commanded his servants, speak to David secretly, and saying, 'Behold, the king delights in you. All his servants love you. Now, therefore, become the king's son-in-law.'" There's something about speaking secretly and flattering secretly. The king delights in you. All his servants love you. Oh, you're so popular. Come on, we really want you in the family. We want you to be the king's son-in-law. And now we see further weakening in the next verse. Verse 23. So Saul's servants spoke these words to David. But David said, is it trivial in your sight to become the king's son-in-law, since I am a poor man and lightly esteemed? Again, he mentions the phrase, the king's son-in-law. Now it's coming first in the conversation, not last. And I'm poor, again, more comparison, lightly esteemed by who? Others, more comparison. Do you see? It's subtle, folks. It's subtle, but it's the fear of man. Wait a second, what do people think? I mean, I'm a poor guy. Nobody cares anything about me, and you want me to become the king's son-in-law. This is not a light thing. Well, Saul, of course, continues with the third-party pressure. Verse 24. The servants of Saul reported to him according to these words which David spoke. Saul then said, thus you shall say to David, the king does not desire any dowry except 100 foreskins of the Philistines to take vengeance on the king's enemies. Now Saul planned to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. This so reminds me of advertisement that you see on television. These, at least you used to. I used to when we would watch such things. But these guys would come on and the phrase was, you don't need money, just a little bit a month. In other words, if you don't have $2,000, we'll be glad to charge you $10 a month with interest for the rest of your life. You don't need money. And Saul is saying, you don't need money. The king loves you. Just kill some of his enemies. Well, anyway, David takes the bait. We see in verse 26, when the servants told David these words, it pleased David to become the king's son-in-law before the days had expired. It's so sad in so many ways, to me anyway. He doesn't say, and nobody says, to become Michal's husband. What it says is to become the king's son-in-law. And we see later on that David, and we'll see this, he becomes flirtatious and becomes proud. Now, later we see and if you would turn to 1 Samuel 19, verse 11, and we see something that happens here. Then Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him in order to put him to death in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be put to death. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went out and fled and escaped. Now, that sounds like, okay, he went out and fled and escaped. But I'm going to add something to this that maybe we've not thought about. As it goes along, Michal took the household idol and laid it on the bed, put a quilt of goat's hair on its head, and covered it with clothes. And I love this. This next verse is actually pretty funny. When Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he is sick. And the messengers went, oh, okay. Now, what does Saul want him for? He wants to kill him. And I can't imagine Saul's frustration and anger with this guy that he sent, go get this guy and bring him in here. Well, we can't bring him because he's sick. And Saul sent messengers to see David, saying, bring him up to me on his bed, that I may put him to death. When the messengers entered, behold, the household idol was on the bed with a quilt of goat's hair on its head. So Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me like this, and let my enemy go, so that he has escaped? Guess what she says? He said to me, let me go. Why should I put you to death? What's he saying? I could just kill you. If you don't let me go, I'm gonna kill you. Now, with this is the thing I want to point out. And if you look in verse 20, Saul says to Michal, Why have you deceived me like this and let my enemy go? Michal lets David out by a window, and he climbs out and he takes off. And I've thought of this so many times when the Lord showed it to me, that the last thing she sees of David is his sorry hide disappearing over the hill there somewhere. David could have said, climb down and you come on with me. What should have David said? Climb down and you come on with me. She helped him get out of there, which was a right and good thing. I mean, that was what she should have done. But David, instead, he repays her by leaving her with a paranoid, violent murderer. Remember, Michal, David's wife, is a woman. And remember how they're treating her. They're treating her like women are often treated, and were certainly treated back then, as just a piece of furniture. And Michal saves him. David leaves her with a psychotic, murderous maniac who had already, at one point, I think this was before then, I can't remember exactly, but we know he tried to kill David in his palace, and we know he also tried to kill Jonathan, and was going to. He tried to pin David to the wall with a spear while they were there eating, and he tried to kill Jonathan. And if you remember the amazing things he says, don't you know that while the son of Jesse is alive, you're not going to have the kingdom? I'm so mad at you, I'll kill you. Well, if he's dead, he's not going to have the kingdom anyway, but Saul didn't think too straight about that. Remember, the fear of man had overcome him. Now, David's act is one of cowardice. That's all there is to it. He left his wife with a madman. And now we come to the next point, which we see, and we've looked at it with these other men, and that's it. The husband does not protect the wife. And David did not take his wife, Michal, with him when she helped him escape Saul. He saved his own life and left her in peril from a madman. The next point that we've talked about is that the wife eventually senses this lack of protection and is deceived by an independent spirit. Michal deceives her own father and lies to him. Helping David escape, that was proper. But lying and deceiving her father afterwards was not required to help David. But she realizes something. I've been abandoned by this guy. He has left me here with my father, who is not the nicest person around, and she knew her life was in danger. And so she knew she had not been protected. David didn't take her along. The next step that we would see in these men and in our lives is the husband vacates leadership. The husband vacates the leadership. David leaves Michal, and he never returns for her. Now, I know you may be thinking, wait a second, he did, but we'll talk about that later. He never returned for her. And when he does demand her back, if you look at it carefully, it only has to do with his ego. He didn't love her. The man that was married to her, because David had done what? He'd abandoned her. And she knew, I have been abandoned. And there was a man that obviously loved Michal, but David becomes king. And while it doesn't say it, I think you can look in it very carefully. This is in 2 Samuel. No, I don't know where that is. I'm sorry, I don't have it written down. But it appears to be vindictive and certainly is not a point of love. And now we come to the fifth point in this, and that is of compromise. And if you remember the compromise, Adam ate, Abram went into Sarah's maid, same thing happening with Isaac. And what does David do? David is in a little bit different position. And what we see is interesting, and the Bible makes sure that we know about this. If you turn to 1 Samuel chapter 25, please. 1 Samuel 25. And we're going to read a few verses here. Verse 42. Then Abigail quickly arose and rode on a donkey with her 5 maidens who attended her, and she followed the messengers of David and became his wife. David also had taken Ahinoam of Jezreel. They both became his wives. Now Saul had given Michal, his daughter, David's wife, to Palti, the son of Laish, who was from Galim. Now, what do we see here? We just saw that David married Abigail and Ahinoam. Now go to 2 Samuel chapter 3, and we'll start reading in verse 2. Verse 1. Now there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew steadily stronger, but the house of Saul grew weaker continually. Sons were born to David at Hebron. His firstborn was Amnon by Ahinoam the Jezreelitess. His second, Chileab by Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite. The third, Absalom, the son of Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth, Adonijah, the son of Haggith. And the fifth, Shephatiah, the son of Abital. And the sixth, Ithream, by David's wife, Eglah. They were born to David at Hebron. Now, okay, David's having sons, and they're listed off in here. David's having these sons born, and that's what, kings have to have, this line of sons for fighting and to become the next prince and king. But to have these sons, he had to add wives. And we see the verses we read before, he added 2. And in the verses we read right now, he added 4. 2 Samuel chapter 5, please. 2 Samuel chapter 5, verse 13, we see, meanwhile, David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. Now, we could look at that and go, wow, he's being prosperous. You could, but you'd be wrong. If you turn to, and I would ask you to do this just so you can read it in your Bibles, turn to Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy 17, and God is listing off through Moses some of the things the king is supposed to be doing. And you look in 17, verse 17 in chapter 17. Neither shall he, the king, multiply wives to himself, that his heart turn not away. Wow. Neither shall he, the king, multiply wives to himself, that his heart not turn away. We know that David began to have struggles. We know full well that Solomon, my word, he was all over the place, had many wives, many concubines. And I'm here to tell you, David's great sin was not his affair with Bathsheba. That was simply a result of what had happened. It was the fear of man in his life, bringing pride. And thereby, he began to multiply wives to himself, concubines. These are basically women that are just there for him to have sex with, not any kindness delivered to them at all. And his heart turning away from God. The fear of man, folks. The selfishness. Remember, fear of man can be looked at with one word, and that is selfishness. Now, and speaking of selfishness, and I want to bring this up, that we see in 2 Samuel 9, we're not going to read through it, but David is on his throne. And you can almost see him sitting there looking pensive and sort of sad. And he asked one of his counselors, "Is there no one of Saul's family that I can honor?" Because Saul and Jonathan have been killed in battle. And David, I'm sorry, this just hits you a little bit political. Is there no one that I could honor? And of course, the story is a really good one of Mephibosheth in Lo-debar, out in the desert. And he's a crippled man, and how David brings him into his house and seats him at the king's table and honors him. But what's interesting is David is married to one of Saul's household. David is married to a woman that risked her life for David. And he sits there and goes, "Isn't there anyone in Saul's family that I can honor?" And he overlooked his own wife. He overlooked a woman that saved his life. And anyway, it sounded good, but I don't know how impressed we should be.